Hello and welcome to Project 300. After a year of waiting, the LandCruiser has finally arrived, and the first major modification is about to happen before it's even been registered. I'm here at TJM Northern Beaches, where the 300 is about to be upgraded with TJM's top-of-the-range suspension system, the XGS Remote, complete with a federally approved 3925 kilo gross vehicle mass increase. TJM also offer a 4100 kilo option, but because I usually run around near empty, I didn't want to go to the heavier rear spring that comes with the larger upgrade. After about 30 years of running twin tube shock absorbers on my four-wheel drives, with the 300 I decided to step it up a couple of notches with a remote reservoir monotube setup. Monotube shocks in general tend to perform better under tough conditions at high operating temperatures than twin tube shocks. Adding a remote reservoir further increases that advantage due to the much higher oil volume, which reduces fade over extended periods of corrugations. After looking at a number of options, I settled on the XGS Remote system and then asked TJM to participate in the Project 300 build. Part of the reason I went with the XGS is that keeping almost 4 tonnes of LandCruiser settled on high-speed dirt can be a big ask. With a huge 20mm rod and 52mm piston, the XGS should deliver excellent performance under such conditions. Now, to put those specs into some perspective, you're talking about a piston that's almost 30% larger than a typical twin tube shock, with more than double the oil volume. That means less heat, and that means less fade. Unlike many remote systems though, the XGS Remote also offers easy 8-way adjustments for both the compression and rebound damping, meaning that you can set the suspension up differently depending on the operating conditions at the time, whether you're just trundling around town empty or you're touring fully loaded down an outback track. There's one more notable feature of the XGS Remote compared to twin tube shocks, and that's the ability to trim the front ride height. This is really useful in situations like mine, where the suspension is the first thing to go in the car, and additional weight from accessories won't come until later. Perhaps the most important factor in this upgrade though is the gross vehicle mass increase of over 600 kilos. The GVM upgrade is vital to keep the 300 legal once I start adding accessories and loading up for a trip. Having the upgrade done prior to first registration provides a second stage of manufacturer compliance plate and means that the new figures apply for the life of the vehicle, even if the registration is transferred interstate at some time in the future. The rules for this upgrade mean that the suspension must be professionally installed by TJM. So let's get the 300 into the hands of Jason and the team and follow the installation. As much as I enjoy installing my own accessories, doing a suspension install up on a hoist is so much better than climbing around under the car with jacks and stands. The install begins on the live axle at the rear. The original springs and shocks are removed. With the linkages and lines all disconnected and the diff supported on a stand, it's a simple matter to pull down the axle housing on each side to install the new Australian-made XGS coils. For this 3925 kilo GVM upgrade, the new rear springs are slightly heavier than standard, being designed for a constant 275 kilos of extra load. For the alternative 4100 kilo GVM upgrade, the rear springs are heavier, being designed for a constant 500 kilo load. Next, it's time to install the new XGS Remote Reservoir shocks. It's a little easier than on the 200 series, with the top shock mount being located outside of the chassis rail. But the high pressure of the monotube design does make compressing the shock more difficult than with a twin tube. With the shock mounted, the remote reservoir is attached to the chassis using the supplied bracket and existing holes. After reconnecting all the lines to the rear axle, it's time to move on to the more complex independent front suspension. The struts first need to be set and assembled. Based on the expected load on the front end, the strut height is set by positioning the preload adjustment ring on the thread at the top of the strut. The strut is then placed upside down in a pneumatic spring compressor to install the spring with the nicely designed slotted coil seat, which slips over the shaft and locates on the bottom of the strut without disassembly. The front trim panels are removed to give easier access to the suspension components. Then, after removing the front sway bar and dropping the outer ends of the lower control arms, the assembled struts can be placed into position. The lower arm can then be swung back up into position and the strut connected, before the lower arm is reattached to the steering knuckle. This is much easier than disconnecting the upper arm via the ball joint, which I did when I installed the suspension on the 200 series. Reattaching the bash plates and the sway bar completes the installation. As was the case with the rear, the XGS Remote install is extremely neat, with the reservoir mounted to a custom bracket and positioned well out of harm's way. So here we are, a few weeks after the suspension installation. I've been driving the 300 quite a lot since the install, including some towing duties and a couple of thousand Ks of highway driving. I'd really expected the ride to be pretty harsh, given the heavy duty springs combined with none of the additional weight, which is going to come from other accessories as the build progresses. And while it's certainly sitting a bit high for those reasons, the ride is remarkably good. I've got the shocks set on their softest settings for now, but despite having almost double the available payload of a standard 300, the ride is actually better than the factory suspension. That's a really big tick for the valving of the XGS Remote shocks. Now though, it's time to head out onto some tracks to see how the suspension performs off the blacktop. My first experience off-road was on some fast dirt with potholes and moderate corrugations. The suspension delivered excellent ride and control, soaking up the imperfections nicely. Have a look at this slow motion clip over an uphill run of corrugations around a bend, and you'll see just how well the shocks perform controlling movement, with no skipping and the car itself floating smoothly over the bumps. It's the same story on a downhill run over the same corrugations under brakes, with the tyres remaining firmly planted and not showing any signs of lock-up. Although I'm setting the 300 up more for touring than slow off-road work, it's still a very important consideration when setting up the cruiser. I'm looking to build the 300 into something that's versatile enough to be comfortable around town and touring on fast dirt, while still being capable in some of the more challenging off-road situations. Like most 300s, mine is unfortunately missing the articulation advantages that come with KDSS suspension. But despite the sway bars stiffening everything up, the new suspension makes up for some of that disadvantage with excellent compliance on the slow off-road work, keeping all the wheels on the ground other than when the sway bars restrict travel in unloaded situations. Overall, the off-road performance of the suspension is extremely good. No matter what sort of terrain I've thrown at it, the 300 always feels comfortable and well controlled. I repeatedly delayed receiving my 300 while I awaited suspension development. It took almost a year of R&D before the XGS GVM Plus upgrade was released, and it's easy to see that the time was well spent. I'd heard plenty of good things about the XGS Remote suspension, which is what drew me to it in the first place once I'd decided to go with a monotube setup in the 300. It really amazes me that this suspension can cost a third of some of the remote res alternatives, but offer more adjustment options, absolutely fantastic performance, full rebuildability, and come with a 3-year warranty. Put all that together and it's very impressive. The adjustability of the shocks is easy and very effective for modifying the ride and handling of the cruiser. While it's not something that'll be changed regularly, I'll certainly be changing the setup between being a daily drive and heading away for a trip. Putting the performance improvements aside, the big GVM increase makes this a great upgrade for any 300 that'll be loaded up with accessories or gear, helping to keep the car legal and insured. Having it done pre-rego is the best option if you're yet to receive your 300, but it's also available from TJM dealers for post-rego installation, where it's approved to the same weights under a state-based system, after being signed off by a local engineer. Before I go, I'd like to thank TJM Head Office for coming on board with Project 300, and also give a shout out to Jason, Ed and the team at TJM Northern Beaches for a fantastic install. One of the reasons I often do my own mods is that the quality of aftermarket accessory installs can be a bit hit and miss, but in this case the installer, Ed, is actually a qualified motor mechanic who used to work for a Formula 3 team in Italy before moving to Australia, so he's very fussy about getting everything right. So that's a wrap for the suspension. Thanks for joining me for the beginning of the Project 300 build. There'll be a lot more content coming as the vehicle grows over the next few years, and I plan on posting long-term updates on all the accessories well into the future. You can follow the build here on YouTube and also on Facebook and Instagram, and please head to the website at project300.com.au for a full write-up on the suspension, plus build details, links to service supplies and a lot more information. See you next time.